Hi, I am John Oppermann, Executive Director of Earth Day Initiative, and happy to be on the Earth Day 2022 virtual stage with Congresswoman Jayapal. Thank you so much for joining us.
John, it's really great to be with you and great to be celebrating another Earth Day and everything we need to do to protect our planet.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot going on right now. But one of the things that we're trying to emphasize with our events and our programs is really that we don't have the luxury of tackling one crisis at a time, unfortunately. Yeah. We really have to move forward on multiple crises at once. And one thing that I wanted to talk to you about is what concerns you the most about the climate crisis? Do you see people in your community, for instance, getting increasingly concerned about the impacts of climate change?
Yes, I mean, I think across my community, across the country, because I chair the Congressional Progressive Caucus, so we're very engaged with the issue of climate change across the country. And I see people, particularly young people, really, in despair about the state of the planet and also the effects on people, real people, and particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous folks who are bearing the burden of the climate crisis. And so I think kind of on every front, we're seeing concerns. And, we also see it in the physical impacts. I mean, just last week, I was back home in Seattle, and we went to visit a number of sites that were dealing with sea level rise. There was a new report that just came out on sea level rise. And the report kind of estimates that by the end of the century, Washington State could see on average nearly 3 feet of sea level rise. That's even as we've been seeing all the storms getting worse across the country, the increased flooding, the tornadoes, the wildfires, and in all of that, communities that are trying to rebuild stronger, and develop their own sense of climate resilience, and also be at the table as we're developing these policy proposals to address the climate crises and the multiple crises that people are facing.
Yeah, and you feel that that is actually coming to your communities, and that you actually feel like people are seeing those impacts in a more direct way. I have seen that, for instance, I'm in New York City, and I think after Hurricane Sandy, for instance, people really got more concerned because they felt like they were seeing the local effects of global climate change. We've seen that with various communities that we work with in areas that are devastated by wildfires or storm surges or hurricanes, more extreme weather events. Can you speak a little bit more to that in terms of what you're hearing from your community directly, the folks that you represent?
Yeah, it's really that, we have a lot of asthma that shows up. And in fact, just recently, just a couple of days ago, there was a report in our local newspaper, the Seattle Times, about the kind of the connection between districts that were redlined and districts that are facing these enormous respiratory problems. We have known for some time that poor people and folks of color often live next to highways where the pollution is the worst and where these communities are affected by that by that toxicity. So that's one area that we've been working a lot on, is just the health effects of fossil fuel production and all of the ways in which that directly affects people. And also in terms of cleanup, we have a lot of work that's being done in the Duwamish River on the Superfund cleanup and removing toxins from the river, and the pollution that occurs there and the effects on health from people who rely on that river, particularly Indigenous folks and folks of color who live around there. And so that's kind of another direct impact. And then, of course, I just met with the director of the Department of Ecology around the wildfires that are sweeping through our communities. Used to be in Washington State that if you had a wildfire, it was towards the end of the summer, and it was on the eastern side of the state. It was the east of the mountains, we used to say. Now those wildfires are occurring west of the mountains as well. And there are so many small fires that our firefighters are completely overwhelmed by that destruction, because they can't catch the fires when they're small, so they become big. They're burning up our forests, and they're destroying our communities. And so there's a lot that we've been seeing just in terms of the wildfire, the smoke that comes from those. And I think at the end of the day, you can connect almost every piece of a person's daily life. We've been doing a lot of work here in Congress on agriculture, and really how do we invest in a sustainable agriculture system and regenerative agricultural system, so that what we're eating, what we're consuming, and how we're growing it is all part of protecting our planet. I think all of those things are connected. And the Progressive Caucus has really prioritized the issue of climate change in our priorities for legislation. And we pushed very hard, as you know, for Build Back Better last year to pass, with real investments into protecting our planet and our people.
So given all of those challenges, and I think what you just said in terms of the ambition is there has been a big push. There are a lot of folks out there fighting for robust and real climate action. It's been challenging, and we haven't seen the action that I think a lot of people want to see. So I realize this is a tough question, but how do we move things forward faster to reach our most ambitious climate action targets? How do we get the speed that the climate crisis really demands?
Well, as you know, the fossil fuel industry is a very big and wealthy industry. And so we are combating a lot of money in politics. We're combating a lot of lobbying efforts, both before we pass legislation to prevent us from passing legislation, but also once we pass it, really trying to make sure that the rules and the implementation is what we want. And so we often see, a lot of opposition there as well. We have identified sort of two routes, right? Like it's a two-tier strategy for the Progressive Caucus. One is the legislative side, and we are still pushing for significant investments in climate to address the climate crisis through whatever we can salvage of what we used to call Build Back Better. In fact, we're going to be meeting with the president shortly about that, as well as a second tier strategy, which is executive actions. These are not replacements for each other. We cannot do through executive action what we could do through legislation. And I want to be really clear about that. But we do think that there are a number of tools that the president can use, the White House can use directly through executive action that will be significant steps forward in addition to legislation we need to pass. So just some examples of that, John, are, first of all, to marshal the enormous purchasing power of the federal government so that we can invest in clean, affordable, homegrown, renewable energy and support energy independence and cut energy costs for everyday Americans. We think that declaring a national climate emergency and invoking the Defense Production Act would allow us to increase the production of renewable energy and emphasize the frontline communities that I was talking about that are most affected by pollution and the climate crisis. And by the way, we think that would bring down energy prices significantly. We also think that if we were to end domestic and international federal fossil fuel subsidies and reinstate the crude oil export ban, that could save taxpayers billions of dollars. And importantly, if we update and strengthen our clean air and clean water protections, we can save tens of thousands of lives annually. So those are all within the executive action bucket that we have proposed, and we will be rolling out to the president directly as well. And we're hopeful that we can move some of those items along. In addition, we're looking at legislation that really combines jobs, justice, and decarbonization, really intersectional legislation. And I've just introduced a bill that we spent almost a year working on, actually, with groups across the country, from the Green New Deal Network, the Sunrise folks, but also people who are directly working with climate resilience and the workforce that is rebuilding communities after these hurricanes and natural disasters come through those communities. It is often immigrant workers and workers who have been previously incarcerated that actually do that work, but they're not protected by a lot of the protections that other workforces have. And so the Climate Resilience Workforce Act that I just introduced does two things. One, it establishes at the federal level within the White House a climate resilience planning office that is specifically around planning at the federal level, but also providing grants and helping local communities and states plan, plus the resources, grant funding to do that proactively. I couldn't believe that there wasn't such an office already in existence, actually, but this act would establish that. And then it would also, a second piece to this is really developing the workforce, the skilled workforce that is capable of responding to and preparing for the destructive impacts of climate change, creating millions of good paying union jobs, and through all of it, centering the communities that are hurt the most by these climate crises. So I'm really excited about that legislation, and there are a number of other pieces of legislation too that we're continuing to pursue. But I think we need to have urgent action this year by the president and by Congress to really be able to make a dent in everything we're facing.
Right. And I think, a lot of folks in the environmental community and also the broader public agrees that what we need to see is really system-wide action and systemic change, like what you're describing here. But the other part that we really grapple with at Earth Day Initiative and just anyone that's connected to the broader public is people are looking for ways that they can play a part in this. And, people feel like their own individual actions don't add up to much, that these challenges are so huge, and you want to do something, and you don't want to discourage people from doing something, from taking action in their own lives, but you want to feel like whatever you're doing does connect to those bigger system changes that we do need. So what would you advise in terms of how can an individual help move things in the right direction? Maybe their actions are not going to solve everything, but how do you give people a feeling of purpose and a feeling of being part of the solution? Because I do think that you need that individual buy-in to really get people excited about it and have people support the bigger system changes. So what would you advise an individual to do?
Yeah, well, I'm an organizer. I come to Congress from 20 years of organizing in the civil rights community and for income equality and so many other things. And I've worked on issues that I'm still working on 20 years later. Immigration reform is an example. We passed a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. I was on the committee that made us the first major city to do that, but we haven't done it yet at the federal level. So I understand how frustrating it can be to people who see the urgency of climate change, want to make a difference right now. And the thing I would say is two things that I have learned through my organizing career. One, that courage actually emerges in the times of most crisis. And so if we can think about the ways in which courageous movements have pushed and pushed and pushed when everything seemed impossible, but they didn't give up. And they actually got strengthened through those most tough times. That is an important thing to keep in mind. And the second is that we're often told as activists, and I'm obviously a progressive activist, but we're often told that, be more realistic. Politics is the art of the possible. Well, if politics is the art of the possible, my belief is that it's our job as activists and organizers, wherever we sit, whether we're out in the community or in Congress, to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible. Because the possible is not static. It changes, and movements provide the pressure that allow the possible to change. And so I think that is the work that we're asking everybody to do, to not give up, to continue to do the work to elect strong progressives in your districts, but also to call, to be part of movements that are taking action and really organizing, not just mobilizing, but organizing, developing diverse grassroots leadership, getting more spokespeople out there, making the case to all the people across the country that I actually think we have with us, but need to be energized to really push for the change we're seeking. That is the work we're asking people to do this Earth Day and every Earth Day, but particularly in this moment where we do have a governing opportunity right now. We do have very slim margins in the House and the Senate, and a very difficult set of crises that the country is facing. But it's the energy, the enthusiasm, and the commitment of people across the country that take action and organize and never give up.
Yeah, I like that idea of pushing the bounds of what's possible. I was talking to someone recently who studies movements and activist movements, and he said something about how what you have to do is accept your successes gracelessly, something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing it, but it's the idea that with every victory, you can accept that, celebrate it, but also push it further, because it does expand the scope of what's possible going forward. And I think that that's what, a lot of folks in the activist movement are trying to do, of move things along inch by inch, but also keep the ambition up. But thank you so much for joining. This was a really great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time here and joining us for the Earth Day virtual stage.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I am fighting as hard as I possibly can to make sure that we get something done that is significant and that really protects our planet and our people.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.